Right, Yuri. It seems quite a long time since I've done one of these for you. It's only been over the weekend, more or less. But just to recap for you, and for me a little bit as well. If you recall, we are looking at Lady Macbeth. If you recall, the basis of this unit of work is for you, at the end of it, to make a judgment on who is the most villainous of the three characters which you're studying, and who is the most heroic. Okay? As I said, the three villains that we're looking at, we have gone through Richard III, we have all but finished Lady Macbeth, and later on this week we'll be looking at a character called Iago from a play called Othello. When it comes to the heroes, I'll be looking at after. We're going to look at a tragic hero in Hamlet, which I'll simplify for you a great deal. Then we're going to look at a heroine in Juliet, and we're going to look at a more typical hero in Henry V. Getting back to Lady Macbeth, forgive me if I keep on checking that we are still recording. Just to recap briefly then, if you remember, we said that there was, as there is a great deal with Shakespearean characters, a sort of duality to them. And by duality, there are two parts to a lot of these characters, and that's what makes them so believable. Because very, very rarely is someone through and through one thing. So when we looked at Richard III, we said clearly he was intended to be a villain. Clearly, historically, particularly to an Elizabethan audience, to a Tudor audience, he was the archetypal villain. And he did lots of villainous things. He did villainous things in the murdering of members of his family, and he very much played that villainous sort of showman, Machiavellian role, playing up to the audience and so on, in order to entertain them. But we also said, when it comes to you making a consideration, that there were, if not heroic tendencies to him, some very positive aspects to his character. His bravery, his determination, his honesty about his dishonesty, the way that he entertains us. He was an intelligent man, okay? He was intelligent in the way that he was able to manipulate other characters, okay? And it probably you would have made, particularly an audience 400 years ago, feel a little bit worried about how they actually found him quite an attractive character. So when it comes to Lady Macbeth, if you recall, we looked at these pictures, and I'm not going to go through those through and through, but we did link her to witchcraft, which I'll go through in a tiny bit more detail when we recap on the previous scene, and the way that she actually takes on a role to manipulate and influence her husband is very, very important. Okay? So, let's move on. If you recall, Macbeth, having met the three witches and finding out actually that he might become king, sends his wife a letter. We can recap on that if you want to look at the last presentation. And in going through that, her first monologue, her first soliloquy, she doesn't actually address the audience, but nonetheless, she's the only character on stage. She identifies a couple of things. One of which is she understands that her husband does have some positive traits. I said at the beginning of the play, Macbeth, albeit it's called the tragedy of Macbeth, so an audience would know what was going to happen, almost. Macbeth is quite a heroic character, okay? And as such, because he wins those battles against MacDonald and then the Fame of Cawdor and the King of Norway, there's a loyalty to him. And even when he is presented, you are Thane of Cawdor and you might be king as well, even though he becomes wrapped in it, even though that he becomes very focused on that objective, you can see that there's a battling of his conscience. You can see that he's actually saying, look, I shouldn't be doing this. I should be loyal to my king. And right up until the event where he and Lady Macbeth murder King Duncan, he is really being pulled every which way. If you remember that poster, where you've actually got Macbeth not only being like a puppet, where he is almost being moved around, his behaviour, what he does is dictated by fate and the supernatural. There was that other poster where his mind is being pulled every which way. And that is very much the case. Lady Macbeth initially seems much, much more focused on the goal. She understands that her husband is too full of the milk of human kindness to catch the nearest way. The nearest way, the quickest way to become king. There's a kindness to him. And she keeps on coming back to that image of milk and purity. That might, a motif, if you remember that repeated idea or image, that might give us some idea about why she is the way that she is. Just in the same way that Richard III, if you remember, was angry with God and angry with nature and angry at the world because he was born deformed, unfinished, sent scarce half made up into this breathing world. Lady Macbeth is angry for a different reason with the world. And because she loves her husband, maybe she wants to prove something to him particularly. Okay? She recognises in her husband that he wants to be king, most highly, the highest station or office in the country, but would do it holily, would do it the right way, waiting for people to die. And then we come on to what she sees her role as. And if you remember those pictures about her whispering to her husband, that I may pour my spirits in thine ear, and chastise with the valour of my tongue all that impedes thee from the golden round. And the golden round, if you remember, is the crown. And she says it is her role to be whispering in her husband's ear, telling him, urging, manipulating him to do what she thinks he has to do to fulfil his destiny and get what he wants and what she wants as well. And again, the beauty of Shakespeare is we don't know characters' motives. We don't know absolutely their reasons for doing things. We don't know their insecurities and their motivations and their fears and their all of those things. And that's what makes it very much the enduring quality of Shakespeare, because we can interpret things how we want to. We can base it on evidence, but we can interpret. That's what I'll be looking for you to do. If you then remember, we went on to this part of her speech, which is very much the dark side of her. So when we're looking at somebody who's through and through villainous, Richard III doesn't actually call on dark spirits. He relies very much on himself. Remember that constant I'm going to do this. We sort of like him for that. She calls on the dark spirits to help her do what she has to do, which suggests that maybe she knows she isn't through and through strong enough herself to do it. And what does she call on those come you spirits that tend on mortal thoughts, on human thoughts? What is it she asks help for? Though she doesn't feel guilt. She doesn't feel remorse. When she says unsex me here, it says make me, if you remember I went through this last time, it says make me like an animal. Make me have no feelings when I actually kill. And at this point it is her who is intending or happily going to do the killing. Okay? And there's that repeated idea of milk. She says, change me so much from being a woman should have more tendencies for kindness, because they bring life into the world, but they shouldn't be the ones who take it from the world. But she's even saying there, take my woman's milk and make it into gall, make it into poison, which is a really, really horrid image. Okay? So, this is where we are, and then what I suggest you do is there is a so I'll just go through the end of this last scene just to remind you as well. And then Macbeth arrives when she's had her speech. And we know he's a powerful character. He's the future king. And so an audience would have been very surprised how little he said. And I said you could interpret this in a couple of ways. It is her taking control. We know she's taking control because she's doing all the talking and she's doing all the flowery or sort of imagery talking. Or we could simply interpret that as us being uncertain whether Macbeth is going to go through this. We know where Lady Macbeth is in this. She is absolutely focused on getting the job done. Macbeth, we can see, we can interpret his words maybe. Tomorrow as he purposes, could be tomorrow as he purposes, I don't know. Or it could be tomorrow as he purposes. Maybe suggesting a little bit more about he's on board with this. Her lines with her husband, oh never shall sun that morrow see. Remember that motif of the sun, meaning the king. The irony is that for them, sunny life, that pathetic fallacy, a life of happiness and hope, is over. There tends to be, with a lot of Shakespeare plays, particularly his tragedies which explore deeper aspects of life, what we call a didactic purpose. There is a message which goes with this. And the didactic purpose of this play, among others, about life, is very much be careful what you wish for. They were absolutely focused on this. They want the power. His fatal flaw was that ambition. Having got it, did it bring more happiness? No. Much, much less. Certainly between the intimacy between the two of them and their relationship, and certainly in terms of what Macbeth thought it would bring him. Okay? To do with friendships and so on. Okay? And it ends with her saying, leave all the rest to me, I'll get this sorted. Now, what I suggest you do, if you look online, I'll put a version of it on here, but I won't waste time doing that now. It's about 25 minutes long. There's an animated tale, so if you just type in animated tale Macbeth, it'll show you exactly what happens. But essentially, Lady Macbeth and Macbeth kill Duncan. They blame it on his guards, and his two sons, Malcolm and Donalbain, then flee, fearing for their own lives. Obviously, because they've run away, Macbeth finds it quite easy to pin the murder on them. Macbeth becomes king. Banquo, the whole time, his friend who is there when he met the witches, starts becoming a bit suspicious, starts becoming a little bit worried about not only what Macbeth did in order to get the throne, but what he is doing once there. Macbeth, having got power, begins to change. He starts getting paranoid, just like Richard III. People around him will be trying to take power from him, just as he took power from the person that he should have been very loyal to in Duncan. And Macbeth starts killing people. He tries to kill both Banquo and Banquo's son, and manages to kill the former of those. He goes back to the witches, and the witches say you have to beware of three things. They have to beware of, number one, when Burnham Wood, a forest, comes to Dunsinane, his castle. He thinks that's impossible. A whole forest cannot uproot and go to a castle. Then they warn him, beware of any man not of woman born. He said, well, all men are born from women, so I've got nothing to worry about there. And then finally they say, beware Macduff. Macduff is another Thane, another lord, who then flees to England. Macbeth kills Macduff's family, his wife and children. And again, obviously what that does is make Macduff even more vengeful against Macbeth. The play comes to a conclusion, just as Richard III did with a battle at Dunsinane Castle, with Malcolm and Donalbain and some armies from England, and Macduff. And in order to shield their numbers, they chop branches off trees from a wood called Burnham Wood, and they advance on the castle. So Burnham Wood is coming to Dunsinane. Macbeth, in spite of that, still thinks he has nothing particularly to fear. Every man is born of a woman. Macduff hunts Macbeth down and faces him. And he announces to Macbeth that he was untimely ripped from his mother's womb, which means simply that he was born from caesarean section. So, strictly he wasn't born from woman was the idea. And at that point, Macbeth realises the game is up, but fights on, just like Richard III. He fights on, and is killed by Macduff, the person the witches told him to beware of. And fate, everything the witches predicted, has come true, has come into being. Now, Lady Macbeth's scene, Act 5, Scene 1. Remember I said there was a word called a foil? A foil can be a character that we compare other characters to. Okay? But a foil can also be a scene. that we compare a scene to. And this is the reverse scene. The scene that we looked at where Lady Macbeth is very, very strong is Act 1, Scene 5. Everything that I've just talked about up until the battle takes place in between, and we get to Act 5, Scene 1, and Lady Macbeth has fundamentally changed. Okay? Now I'll go into this, I'll click on a couple of things that you can see it. So, wrong glasses, putting on my sunglasses. Time. So we get to this, and basically it's called, like I said, it's called a chiastic structure, where Macbeth, essentially, he falls down from being a hero to an absolute villain, whereas Lady Macbeth, throughout the course of it, grows further apart from her husband, and her conscience, that thing she called on the evil spirits at the beginning of the play to help her conscience gets the better of her. And very, very tragically, she goes mad with her guilt. So by the time we get to Act 5, Scene 1, she is there being watched by a doctor, by a physician, and her nurse. And they're watching her, and what is she doing? Very, very famous line. She's there washing her hands, obviously something we're all very, very used to now. Washing her hands, and washing her hands, and washing her hands, and washing her hands. What is she washing her hands for? Duncan's blood. She still sees Duncan's blood on her hands. So she keeps on seeing spots of blood. Out damn spots, she keeps on saying. And the whole time she's in somewhat of a trance. She's being watched by the doctor, always washing her hands, always washing her hands. And what she does in Act 5, Scene 1, is revert very much back to not just the night that they killed Duncan, and revisits it in her language as well. But also, she revisits her childhood. And that's what makes it so very, very sad. She wants someone to take away her guilt. She wants someone to take care of her. She can't rely on her husband anymore, and I'll show you exactly his reaction to what happens. And the language she uses in Act 1, Scene 5 was full of imagery, powerful language. Think of that speech, calling on spirits. And this one, she's sort of whimpering. She says little things like, "Here's the smell of blood still. All the perfumes of Arabia will not sweeten this little hand. Oh, oh, oh." She's saying that all the perfumes in Arabia will not get the smell of blood off her hands. And that is clearly a sign of her guilt. Okay? And the other thing she keeps on doing is saying little nursery rhymes. She keeps on saying that Macduff, who kills Macbeth at the end, as I said, Macbeth kills his wife and family. And Macduff was called, or is called, the Fame of Fife, which is another area of Scotland. And she'll say little nursery rhymes like, "The Fame of Fife had a wife, where is she now?" And like I said, it's a very, very tragic scene. Just bear with me a moment.